Okay, this is an additional lecture this week, or an additional component. The lecture on hypothesis testing is very large, so I wanted to include a small section that just highlights one of the most important parts of the overall lecture. This is something that's going to reoccur on every test from here on out. It's going to be a very important point of the class. You could kind of, if you had to boil down the entire class into one section or one point, it would be the null hypothesis testing approach, which is what we're going through here. The 5 steps of hypothesis testing that I'm going to outline here should be used in any case where we are testing something using inferential statistics, where we are using t-tests, ANOVAs, even later when we're using correlations, we can use this null hypothesis testing approach. These 5 steps are almost identical to the 5 steps outlined in your textbook. If you go by your textbook, your answers are going to be correct. I like using the 5-step approach to kind of delineate things in a better way. Let's get right into it. Step 1 is state the hypothesis. So for what we're doing in this class, we're going to start with t-tests pretty soon. So I'll go ahead and do an example of stating the hypothesis. Step 1, state the hypothesis. We need to state a null and an alternative. That's supposed to be an A. That's terrible. A null and an alternative hypothesis for an independent groups t-test. Let's go with an independent groups t-test example. The null hypothesis would be the mean of group 1 is equal to the mean of group 2. This example will be for a non-directional independent measures t-test. So those words are going to become more meaningful as the class goes on. The alternative hypothesis would be that the mean for group 1 is not equal to the mean for group 2. These are all the steps necessary for step 1, state hypotheses. You will always have a null and alternative hypothesis. So that part will always remain the same. There will always be a null hypothesis. There will always be an alternative hypothesis. The particular form of the null and alternative hypothesis, how they are going to look, is going to be similar across all inferential statistics techniques, but will not be identical. Okay, step 2 is set criteria. This refers to we need to decide what alpha level we're going to use for this particular hypothesis test beforehand. This helps us determine the critical values, which is the next step. So generally, we're going to use alpha equals 0.05. So it might be better even to watch this short tutorial after you've got into t-tests a bit and know the terminology. Alpha equals 0.05 is what we're going to set for most experiments. This, as I mentioned before, is going to be a two-tailed test. Most examples, if it is not explicitly stated that you're using a directional test, or it's not explicitly stated that the hypothesis we're interested in is only directional, then we can assume that the test we're using is two-tailed. So for step 2, set criteria, we're using alpha equals 0.05, a two-tailed test. Step 3 is obtain our sample and compute our test statistic. Don't have any hypothetical data right now, but I said it's an independent groups t-test, so we're going to compute a t-value for this example. Let's say it's 1.89. That's a generic example of a t-statistic. It's a realistic value. So we're going through, for step 3, sort of go through all the steps to compute the t-statistic, which I'm not going to cover here, but is covered in other lectures. Step 4, compare the sample to the null hypothesis. Now, this is the step that might trip people up that are new to this hypothesis testing approach. So this is the step in which we'll need the t-critical value. You can get the t-critical value in step 2 or step 4 when you need it. It doesn't matter either way. In this example, we have degrees of freedom equal to 28. And using the t-critical table in the back of the book, we find that the t-crit is equal to about 1.70. We would need to find this value in step 2 or step 4. Doesn't matter as long as we find it. And step 4 is when we compare the value predicted by the null hypothesis to the actual value. So the actual value that we calculated was equal to, what was that, 1.8. Can't find it. 1.89, I'm pretty sure it was. So we find that 1.89 is greater than our critical value of 1.70. So we've done the comparison. We know that our calculated value is greater than our predicted value. There's where we move to step 5. Because our critical value was greater than our predicted value for a two-tailed test, then our conclusion is that we reject the null hypothesis. If in another example our calculated value was less than our critical value, we would fail to reject the null hypothesis. Now, if you're listening to this first thing, this talk is not going to make much sense by itself, but I would use it. Come back and listen to this after you've read the book about the t-tests, after you've listened to the lectures about t-tests, and see if this process makes sense to you. If you're listening to this and you're still a little fuzzy on the process, that's a good check for test 2 that is coming up. Alright, if you haven't already, make sure to listen to the broader lecture going over this process and going over all the details of the steps and why the steps are necessary.